morning, everyone. Welcome to the National At-Home Dad Network's webinar series. We're here today with Brock Sayer. Brock's here to talk to us about using Dungeons and Dragons as a teaching tool for our kids. Brock is a friend of mine. He lives here in the area. He is also a stay-at-home dad. We actually met through playing D&D together, and I've been great friends ever since. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Brock. Again, please, if you're watching on Facebook, feel free to ask questions in the chat. If you're with us here live in Blue Jeans, you can also put any questions you have in the chat window here. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over there to Brock Sayer.
Hello. Hi, I'm Brock. I've been playing Dungeons and Dragons since 1989. I've been DMing it since 1990, so about 31 years now. I have spent about 4 years as a paid Dungeon Master, predominantly through schools, where I was working with twice exceptional children. The games were explicitly educational in nature, in addition to just being fun. Either teaching them to play D&D or teaching material through the game. I've also written and edited some D&D books that are on DM's Guild. I'd say the D&D's been a big part of my life for a very long time. I'm happy to chat about how to approach it from an educational standpoint. There's kind of a variety of approaches on that front. You could divide it up by sort of subject or the skill level of the kids. Which do you think would be a good way to start on that, Matt?
Well, we'll start with the obvious. I mean, we all have kids of different ages. You talk about doing this with kids that run the spectrum. What's the youngest group of kids that you've worked with?
The youngest kids that I've worked with, my own children, I've ran D&D games with them since they were old enough to talk. I have a picture of my youngest literally in one of those little baby chairs holding the character sheet. But on a professional level or with other people's kids, we're talking maybe second graders is probably the youngest it's gone for my older boy and all of his friends. I ran a weekly game for maybe 6 or 7 years. So I saw them grow up from, like I said, about second graders to junior high and high school in some cases. So obviously it's very different experience for the young ones as opposed to the older ones. With your youngest, you're really aiming for just engagement. You're encouraging the imaginative play, thinking about what their character would do, trying to figure out how to solve the problem. Pretty much any amount of math or reading or writing that you can get them to do is great, but you can't let that interfere with their fun, because at the end of the day, you need to keep them engaged for it to be an activity they're going to want to come back to. That varies heavily. With really young ones, it's pretty much just roll the die. It's a big number. It's a small number, right?
Right.
And I'm doing the math in my head for them, and occasionally tweaking it, because there's a certain ratio of success to failure, I think, that small children need to experience to stay engaged. Too much success or too little, and you're gonna lose them.
Okay, well, I was going to say, that brings up the next topic is, one of the other things that D&D definitely teaches you is that, you're not always going to win.
Right. And I think that's absolutely critical to part of what makes D&D such a great activity for children, is it is kind of a contained way to experience that in it's I guess an impersonal kind of way, right? It's in the
Right.
hands of the dice, you know, so it's hard for them to be mad at a person. Like that person is to blame for why I did not succeed, right? They can be mad at the dice, that's fine.
But
Grown-ups are mad at
but
their dice all the time.
yeah, odds are they'll still end up being mad. I know I started playing D&D back when I was around 8 or 9, and I know that there was many a time that I was angry with whoever's older brother was DMing at the time.
Oh, sure, absolutely. Well, especially when you're a kid and your DM is a kid. And sadly, it sometimes extends into being an adult, right? There's many a DM that has a confrontational approach. They want to beat the players. They want to like make you sad, kind of, right? They want you to feel like genuine despair or something. And obviously, that's not really helpful on the approach I'm talking about. I mean, kids learn better when they're having fun and they're happy and they're feeling successful, right?
Right.
So that is part of it right there, is as leaving sort of that old school uh, DM versus player attitude behind, right? You know, the more modern view of collaborative storytelling um, is really one of the cornerstones of successful um, playing with kids, where it's educational and fun.
Cool. Now with the older kids, what's the older groups that you've worked with? I know that for a while you were actually doing a class that was being done out at a local gaming shop here in town, Atomic Empire.
Yeah, yeah. At Atomic Empire, they graciously allowed us to use one of their rooms um, uh, for an excellent deal because we were a nonprofit. And so what we had was a group of teenagers. They were no longer attending traditional schools. They were involved in homeschooling or some other non-traditional school applications, and this was part of that system. So they ranged from maybe 13 up to 18. So it was pretty much the whole high school gamut, and those class sizes could run from 3 or 4 kids to well over a dozen,
Oh,
depending on the semester. Um, yeah, so there's some table management issues for size purposes. Something that actually worked really well with the large group was splitting them into teams and having different sort of some of the more advanced students take turns DMing one of the groups while I was, or even maybe both groups, while I was kind of like overseeing the overall process. And then, of course, I made the story reflect that, where each team was involved in a different part of the larger quest, that kind of a thing. Um, so, so different semesters of that class were teaching different things. Like one semester was overtly the learning Dungeons and Dragons. So one of the things
okay.
they were learning was the history of Dungeons and Dragons. Like I brought up the charts showing, the Beckme era and first edition and second edition and the splits and hey, here's the Pathfinder branch and et cetera, et cetera. And one of the things we did through the course of that semester was I ran the students through an adventure using every edition of D&D. So oh yeah, right. So they'd have to make characters in that edition, run an adventure in that edition. I mean, obviously it was uh, stripped down and streamlined for that kind of a process. But
Right.
right, and each adventure was key to something sort of like iconic for that edition. And then the adventure itself led them through all the major settings of the Dungeons and Dragons. So they got to meet a lot of the famous heroes and villains from all the different worlds. They met Raceland and Dritz Do'Urden, et cetera, et cetera. They were in Greyhawk. They were in Spelljammer. One of the players kicked Strahd in the face. Uh, you know, second edition Strahd,
Yeah.
sure. Um, but so,
So
so that,
on a more traditional side, I know we're talking about like the history of D&D. I know that when I was a kid, playing, I learned a lot about actual like medieval history and like weaponry and that type of thing, as
Okay.
well as like different mythologies for different
Mhm.
cultures and that type of thing. And a lot of those things like ended up popping up in my history and social studies classes down the road.
Oh yeah.
Um, is that something that you're able to incorporate fairly regularly?
Yes, I had a different semester. Like I said, every semester had different themes. So the kids would want to take the class over and over, right, and learn different things. So another semester had a history theme specifically. So I always, when you decide what your focus is, you need to make sure that your story and game mechanics reflect that. So for the history semester, they were playing the characters they were playing were being reincarnated. So they would get reborn over and over again, just battle the same sort of immortal enemy or whatever, right? Like the Great Snake of Chaos or something, if I recall.
Right.
And so, they started off in a Paleolithic hunter-gatherer tribe, and then they were later reincarnated at the dawn of the Bronze Age, and then later they were reincarnated at the edge of the Roman Empire in Germania. I worked through all these different time frames. Yeah. And so then they had a modern era, they had a future one near the end of the semester where everybody was getting plasma rifles, before like the final grand, the final of the class, which was essentially the big boss battle, as they saved the timelines. So of course for that one, now that one I was using fifth edition the entire time. I think fifth edition is a really good choice for new players. It's very streamlined and simple compared to a lot of the other editions.
Yeah.
And so for that one, of course, the wrinkle was introducing the appropriate technology for each setting. In the Bronze Age, I had to talk about, well, this is the way bronze armor and the bronze weapons are going to function, et cetera, et cetera. Um, so that helped that they'd all played fifth edition a little bit before at that point, because obviously the default fifth edition setting, which is the sort of vaguely Dark Ages Europe, everything's like steel, etc. Um, so to accurately reflect Stone Age weapons and things like that, you end up with a lot of sort of specialty weapons with worse statistics, basically, right? And
Hmm.
for that experience to feel meaningful to the students, it helps if they understand what the default is, so that when you
Right.
give them their Stone Age weapons, here's your stone axe, and they're like, man, this ain't no mace.
Right.
Like they need to, it helps kind of feel that, right? And I did tend to base them around sort of transitional conflicts, right? Like uh, the Bronze Age era one, they were not part of the Bronze Age when that game day started. They were a tribe who like came and saw like the walled city off in the distance, and they were like, "What the heck is this thing?" I sort of had them experience sort of the awe and terror a little bit of seeing, the ziggurat rising above the city walls and just like right and seeing the strange material these people are wearing, which their stone axes are breaking against, right?
So
Um, mhm.
we just had somebody pop up with a question saying that they would love to hear more about the benefits for second edition kits. Which, to be honest, that was about where I started taking my break. I cut my teeth on the first edition AD&D, and as second edition was starting, life got in the way of being able to, play, and I
Right.
missed most of like third and fourth. But one of the things that I remember, especially about early D&D, was just the huge importance of math.
Oh yes.
Computing THACO.
Oh yeah. No, I play in a second edition game still or now. Um, because like I said, I started in 89, 90, which is right when second edition was being released. So for me, the first edition, second edition, basic D&D transition period is where I started. And so my first big spike of play as a teenager was in fact second edition. Second edition is always going to have a place in my heart, 100%, for that very reason. It is very math heavy compared to, say, fifth. So second edition is a great choice if what you're wanting to teach is math. I mean, every edition gives you plenty of opportunities to improve your kids' math. 100%. It's just a very mathy sort of game. Your addition is going to get a lot faster. But second edition lets you work on your subtraction a lot more. Because yeah, you're like, okay, I need to take my THAC0 and then subtract the negative armor class of this dragon. So second edition puts you in a math position much more so than, I wouldn't say necessarily than any other edition. Um, the
So,
mathiest is probably technically third.
so for anybody who is not familiar with second edition, you keep hearing us talk about THAC0. When I started playing, there were these big charts that you followed to figure out what you had to roll to hit a creature. And in second edition, they created a flat number, which was what you had to roll to hit AC 0. Unfortunately, armor class went from -10 to +10. So you had to either subtract a number or subtract a negative number to figure out what you actually needed to hit with, which, again, that was kind of a big deal when you were a kid learning to subtract negative
Oh,
numbers.
absolutely. Not to mention in the second edition era, still, sometimes you needed to roll high, sometimes you needed to roll low, depending on the type of roll. Saving throws and attacks and skill checks. Some of which you had to roll high, some you had to roll low. Sometimes you were adding, sometimes you were subtracting. Sometimes you were adding or subtracting from the number you were aiming for. Sometimes you were adding or subtracting from the die roll. Um, Second edition was trying to combine and organize and streamline a lot of the earlier D&D. And I would say it succeeded in a lot of ways. I mean, it didn't have those charts anymore, right?
Yeah,
Uh, but it was still tricky. Like,
it was still cumbersome.
oh yeah, everybody had little arrows on their character sheets, right, next to things. A little arrow pointing up or a little arrow pointing down to try to remind themselves whether they needed to roll high or roll low. People were basically recreating those charts on the back of their character sheet, so they didn't have to try to do the math every time. They just like calculated out to the side. For each armor class, roll this number. Um, so, uh, I mean, I think it's really important uh, to use the math for your kids at whatever level they're comfortable with. Um, for my younger kids, sure, I might do the math for them basically, but always make sure they're the ones rolling the dice.
Right.
That's so central. But
Well, yeah.
uh, but certainly
Everybody
as they
wants to
get older,
roll dice. That's the fun part.
right? Exactly, right. Let them roll the dice as much as you can. I will even say letting them roll the dice for monsters and stuff can be a lot of fun. Like as the DM, I might roll to see if the monster hit, but I might let the kid roll to see how much damage the monster just did to them. Right? Just
Right.
so they're physically engaged more, right? Um, but then uh, obviously as they're older, I may just assume they're going to do all their math themselves. Uh, but it's very, very specific. I've had many students with learning differences related to math or reading or writing. So every student needed a very different experience. I had to be very cognizant of this student will need my help to figure out whether or not they hit. Right? But their character sheet is going to be solid. This other student, they'll be handling the math fine, but they're going to have a lot of trouble remembering where on their character sheet this fact is or that fact is, and that's always going to be the case. People have created alternate versions of character sheets specifically for dyslexic people or other types of scenarios with color coding or special fonts or different
Neat.
rearrangement. Yeah,
Yeah,
they're
I was not
excellent.
aware of that. Is that
Uh-huh.
something you can just search like online for, like dyslexic based character
Yeah,
sheet or that
absolutely.
type?
Yeah.
That's really interesting. I had never heard of that. That's
Uh-huh.
cool. That's cool as anything.
Oh yeah, yeah. No, it's great. They'll reorganize things in lots of ways. Some are more sort of designed for people who are more sort of pictorially oriented. Like I've seen some where it's literally got a picture of like your hero, and almost all of your numbers are like laid out according to how they're relevant to the picture. Even right,
Gotcha.
like look at the weapon if you want to know the weapon stuff. Look at the armor for their armor info. You know, etc. Yeah, yeah. There's a lot of different character sheet variations out there, and they can make a world of difference. I mean, uh, as well as you have something that's really important is to figure out the child's interests. If they like to draw, some kids are doodlers anyway. If they're going to be doodling all over their character sheet, man, give them some graph paper. Try to see if you can get them to actually map a dungeon. Most kids hate it and won't do it, but if you get a kid who loves it, encourage it. Why not? Have them create dungeons ahead of time and give them to you, and then just start using them later in the game. They get a real sense of joy and ownership if the party is going through a dungeon, and then they suddenly recognize part of the floor plan is one they made for you a month ago.
Oh, that is really cool.
Yeah. Um,
So one of the other things that I was going to bring up is I know one of the things that I got a lot out of D&D as a kid was, if nothing else, it certainly taught me how to, for lack of a better term, research. As you're perusing table of contents, index, whatever, desperately trying to find that one little scrap of information that you need in that exact moment to prove that, no, yes, you really did do that much damage.
oh yeah, absolutely. Um, yes, as part of running that, I had multiple copies of all the books that for all my kids to use. 3, 4 players handbooks, a couple DMGs. I even had a spare monster manual out there because between all the people summoning stuff or turning into stuff, they're still getting some monster looking up. Um, so I did try to discourage looking up the monster they were fighting.
Yes.
Um, but let me tell you, they will if you give them a chance. But no, you're right. I will say that has changed a lot though over time because something that was sort of a generational thing for me was I'd expect that to happen, and instead I'd see them all go do 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 do, right?
That's
And they
true.
would, yeah,
Research
right,
is a different skill these days. It's much
right,
more search engine based.
sure. Though still very much a skill. And then I'd end up with several of my students would just start buying like D&D Beyond and things like that, and just using those online resources because they wanted to have their character and this list of the subclasses and the racial lists and all that stuff on their phone. Of course, I'm old school. I want the paper. Partially, I want the paper because I kept them all in between
Hmm.
classes, which is very useful for me. It's almost like collecting homework, right? Like I could go through and see whether or not they wrote down that they'd used their spells or whether or not they'd marked down they'd used their items. It made it a little easier for me to plan my next session if I could just look at everybody's sheet and know what they had going on. Um, I could see who was doodling what in the corners, who was taking notes. Because if a student is taking notes on the corner of their sheet about some characters they met, uh, reward that. Have that character come up again,
Oh
right?
yeah.
If they write a fact down, make sure that fact will be useful later, not useless.
Now,
Uh,
somebody just asked a really interesting question, something I had never thought about. Again, I think this is a generational thing, but you were talking about getting a kid to like map out a dungeon, give them some graph paper. Is that the kind of thing that somebody could use Minecraft to design?
um, absolutely. Um, so here's how I've seen Minecraft come up in a couple of ways, actually. I've absolutely had students go off later and then be like, "Hey, in Minecraft, I built that cool place we were hanging out in our last week's adventure." Where like the D&D game was just inspiring their Minecraft play, and which is awesome, right? Like you want them making those sorts of connections. Um, I have, and I some of the teenagers that I ran with now that they're older and they're running games for each other. I still sort of hear back sometimes the stuff they're up to, and I know that some of them have made Minecraft servers where they've essentially created like their own little fantasy world with their own like constitution and rules and stuff, and like they plan. Um, Something I haven't personally done is run one of those like Minecraft servers where I was sort of like the DM and set up the maps and stuff and have them go through it and try to like really integrate that. Um, I would say it's pretty doable, especially if you're already using like voice chat and things like that. It would almost be virtual LARPing, right? Right, like the two people meet and you're like paper, rock, scissors, right? Like who
Right.
got blasted with the fireball? Where instead you're like Minecraft, you meet, and then you're like, you know, because maybe you can have them fight the monster, or maybe you could be like, all right, now that we've met, now we roll, because there's like online dice rolling things as well. You can really integrate technology in a lot of very interesting ways. Now, I do prefer to have the kids play face to face, partially because I'm older, right? But I do think because they do get so many opportunities to play online in so many ways, that encouraging the face to face communication and interaction is just really healthy.
Yeah.
Um, Especially since uh, kids are already imaginative. When they're younger, they're used to doing sort of like, I pretend to be this, I pretend to be that. And then as they get older, that can kind of fade. Like as you're a teenager, instead of being like, I pretend to be a cat, instead you're like, I'm pretending to be cooler than I feel I am. Right?
Yeah, that never worked for me, but yeah,
Right.
I understand the concept.
Right. So, you're still, as a teenager, you're still sort of trying on personalities, but it's different. And D&D is great for that because, you're playing the edgy rogue or the tree hugging druid or whatever, and you're taking some aspect of your personality that you're already exploring a little bit in the real world, and you're allowing it to kind of like dial it up to 11 in a more comfortable space. And so when you're playing in person, you're allowing the teenagers to interact with each other in these ways with a little bit of a distance because it's their characters. So instead of having the distance of being virtual, but themselves, instead the distance is they're in person, but they're not really themselves.
So again, one of the people that we have watching us live was talking about how his kids actually learned to play D&D with an adult DM during on Zoom
Mhm.
during the pandemic quarantine, which I know a lot of people converted over to playing online, including us during
Oh yeah,
quarantine.
yeah,
I will point out that there are several different platforms that really, really do help out with that. I personally use one called Fantasy Grounds. There's another one called Roll20. Basically, they're similar. One of the issues that I have with them personally is just the fact that, I had to go back and repay for rule books that I already owned physical copies of.
right.
I had to go and pay for the digital copies. But having spoken with you after you wrote your and I'm blanking on the name. I keep wanting to say Al Qadim, but that's the old
Yeah.
one.
Well, Al Qadim is the second edition setting. Yeah, ours is the Adventures in the Land of Fate, the fifth edition
Right.
upgrade, which is available on Fantasy Grounds. That's right.
Right. Well, I was going to say, I remember when you published the book, I bought a copy of the book, and then when it came out on Fantasy Grounds, I purchased the one on Fantasy Grounds, mostly because you were the one that told me exactly how much effort and work goes into doing that, where literally somebody has to code that entire rule book.
Oh yeah, yeah. He
Um,
did he did a good job, and it was a lot of work. And that I myself used Roll20 more than Fantasy Grounds. I've mostly used Fantasy Grounds with you as the DM, and we ran two, maybe three whole adventure sets, right?
yeah,
I
I
mean,
think so.
we did Fandalen,
Right.
and now we're in
The Lost Laboratory of Kowalish.
right,
Yeah, so we've done those too, but Fendalen's a long one.
yeah, yeah. And I've used Roll20 to run. I actually did some playtesting for my Al-Qadim book in Roll20.
Hmm.
And I've also used it for my homebrew settings that I run with some friends. Um, I've ran the D&D game before where I literally just opened up a Zoom meeting and shared a Google Doc and was like, "Hey, I'll just draw real quick." I did a screen share um, in a Zoom meeting and was just like drawing on my screen, like, "Hey, yeah, here, look at this picture," right? Because yeah, obviously we've all been online a lot these last few years,
Oh yeah.
and so I think you can have a very, very good online experience role playing if you for very little money and not that much effort. Now that you've started to get more sort of comfortable with being online anyway, uh, I have that's actually a great way to play with sort of say nieces and nephews and stuff. Right, if you're like looking for, especially with all this distance, you want your kids and your siblings' kids to like hang out and get to know each other. But having them just sit on a Zoom is like boring and they wander off and you're like, no, come back here and talk to grandma and grandpa. Instead, play a D&D game, right? If you have an activity, then it makes a world of difference.
Oh yeah. And I will say, having played both, online and played, in person, again, it may be a generational thing, but I really prefer that face-to-face contact. There's a certain level of camaraderie that comes with everybody like hanging out around the table
Sure.
together.
Oh yeah.
However, that being said, um, the whole reason that I use Fantasy Grounds is it's just that's the system that I learned on.
Sure.
And I joined a group of adult players on Fantasy Grounds. Good Lord, it had to have been around 5 years ago because it was before
What I
Patrick. It was before my son Patrick was born.
Yeah.
And we used to play like one night a week, and then we started playing during the day while the kids were in school, and then the pandemic happened, and we went back to playing one night a week at night because we were all, doing distance
Sure.
learning with our kids, so there was no chance of doing it. And I've gotten to be really close with a lot of these guys, and I've never actually well, I've met one of them in person because he was at Home DadCon, but that was about it. But as far as education goes, I could easily see where some of those online formats would help out. Now, one of the last areas that I wanted to bring up that role-playing games in general and Dungeons and Dragons specifically do a really, really good job with is a skill that, well, I remember they used to teach it when I was in middle school, which was creative problem solving,
Right.
where you put a problem in front of the kids and they have to use non-simple like you can't necessarily just hack and slash your way
Right.
out of every situation.
hmm Right. Oh no, that's to me that's kind of one of the most fun parts of D&D. I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, I'll min-max myself a cool monster fighter any day. Um, but solving puzzles and the social interaction are also two really important parts. Um, it can be tricky. Like younger kids is actually less of a problem I found. With younger kids, you just give them a problem and they'll start trying to solve it in any sort of crazy old way. Like it's almost guaranteed to be something you never would have thought of. And especially with younger kids, you have a tendency to kind of roll with it. You're like, really? You're gonna make friends with the gibbering mouther by yelling gibberish back at it? Huh. All right, we can work with this. Like little kids, it's the sort of older kids. It can be trickier. Certainly on the social level, they may be more nervous about being embarrassed, right, if their plan doesn't work. But especially if they're new to D&D and they're more coming out of board games, collectible card games, video games, they assume that there's really one correct answer and they're essentially waiting for you to have like the little diamond shape appear over like the correct approach. They're like waiting for the NPC to wander up and be like, choose one of these three options.
Right.
um and so the more free form nature of the game can be intimidating. And it's really important that you not um I guess shame them over that, right? They're going to be stuck and a little confused, especially um, for those who've come up with sort of a generational, most games being kind of handheld on that front. You have to take them where they're at. So you may have to hold their hand more earlier on. You may have to literally have that NPC who's kind of like, I can think of about three good solutions to this. I'm not sure which I would choose. Um,
Right.
but you have to really reward those sort of off the wall attempts, especially at the beginning, to help them build that kind of confidence to experiment and try things. In that sense, fifth edition is also a little better because it's a little less lethal than the old days. Back in the old days, you try something a little off the wall and you're all dead. Um,
Right.
that doesn't really encourage what we're looking for here. That problem solving, really important. You really let your kids get going, and it's great. You and I were talking earlier where I just left them stranded on a Spelljammer ship once. Because I like to give them problems that I don't know the solution to yet either. Because I'm pretty comfortable as a DM. So I'll give them a problem I don't have a solution to yet and see how it
Real
goes.
quick, before you start that story, we have somebody who's about to have to leave, and they have a really, really good question. They were saying, how can they learn the basics of D&D so that they can play with their kids? Because their kids learned over Zoom. They were
Right.
saying their library has a club for adults, but it's intimidating to go in as the only new guy.
Sure.
Are there online classes or beginner campaigns?
Absolutely both. Absolutely. Um, so you can actually go to the Dungeons and Dragons website. I couldn't tell you the exact link off the top of my head, but if you basically just Google it, they have, especially for fifth edition, they have a stripped down intro rule set that you can download for free. I mean, they want you to start playing. Um,
First hit's always free.
that's right. Um, and so you can go, you can download just a couple of pages, pre-generated character sheets, even a short little adventure. I think it's actually the intro to the Lost Mines of Phandalin because it's designed to lead into that. Um,
Well, another one that I will bring up is I will say most of the adult players that you will find, especially the adult players who are more experienced and have been playing for a while, people need to remember D&D has recently become very, very popular and socially acceptable with celebrities. It was not always like this. Most of us grew up being ridiculed for even playing.
oh yeah,
So odds are if you join an adult group and you just be upfront with them and be like, look, I've never played before, but I'd really like to. I've never found a group that has been like condescending towards people who are new to the game or anything like that.
yeah, that's
There
actually
might
pretty
be one or
rare.
two individuals who are just kind of not nice, but I think that's more on them than it is on the game and the community.
Yeah, yeah, I'd say in general, people are like, yay, more players, right? Because there's always entropy, right? Like you're always players leave. So having a constant stream of new players is great because it means your game will keep going longer. Um, yeah,
But yeah, I wouldn't be intimidated to go to your local library
no,
because
no.
for all of the stripped down versions of the rules and the rest of it, I stick by the facts that the easiest way to learn the game is to play.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean,
Um,
there's certainly a million, at least, podcasts and Twitch streams and live plays, uh, and Discords. Just the people just hanging out, playing, and letting other people watch them play is enormous at this point. Um, so the real trick to that is just to not get intimidated because, of course, a lot of those folks are semi-pro, right? So they've got like endorsements and are like, in some cases, are literally professional voice actors. So that can be intimidating. This sort of that sort of a level, but
I
yeah,
will point out for the people who watch those professional streams, I can promise you most regular tabletop games, there are not a huge amount of people doing character voices or that type of thing. there's a little bit there's a little bit of like interaction as your character, but for the most part, there's a lot of, my character says this,
Sure.
as opposed to you acting it out, in your own voice. But a lot of that depends on the table. I mean,
Yeah, it's a
again,
continuum, right?
you
It's
know,
a continuum based on everybody's comfort level.
and
I
if
mean,
you do act something out, I doubt anybody's going to make fun of you. Odds are a lot of people are going to laugh because usually I find whenever somebody suddenly acts something out, it's usually something that they're doing to be funny.
absolutely. Yeah.
Well, look, so why don't you go ahead and let's finish off with that story that you were telling about the creative problem. And
Oh, sure.
then we're going to go ahead and wrap this up because it is getting to be lunchtime for a lot of us. So we either need to feed the kids that are at home or feed ourselves and get a few things done before the kids come home from school.
Yep, both. Yeah, yeah. So yeah, sure. Just real quick, that little problem solving bit. That's was during this semester when I was having them go through the history of D&D. So they're wandering through Spelljammer because they were looking at every setting. Right? I had to make sure I got them all in. And so they were adrift in space, and there's calculations that I made them do because they were all like high school students. So I made them do the calculations about how long their air was going to last, and they realized they did not have enough air to make it to Prin space. I think is where they were going next. Um, and so I was just kind of like, I don't know, what you guys gonna do about it? Right? And everybody's going through their spell sheets and arguing and debating, right? They're like, let's throw the crew overboard, that kind of thing. They're
Right.
having like ethical discussions about, what to do. And then one of them realizes they've got the breathe water spell, and so they calculated how many times they could cast the breathe water spell per day and how long it lasted. And they had to calculate, could it get them enough air? So we ended up with about half the party at any given time was sitting there with their heads stuck down in water buckets, just breathing the buckets. And then that led to an interesting discussion where they were like, but wait a second. If I'm breathing, right, when fish are breathing underwater, it's because they're breathing the dissolved oxygen out of the water. So are we using up the dissolved oxygen from these buckets? And I was like, heck no, it says you're breathing water. It's magic. And right, and that led to a discussion about the D&D physics, which is largely based off of Aristotelian physics, as opposed to like modern Newtonian or Einsteinian or what have you. Uh, so that ended up leading to a whole discussion about physics and the different underlying conceptions of what reality is and how it works. Um, and so, because those assumptions is what led them to figure out what kind of things were possible in their problem solving, right? So, you really gotta give them a challenge and let them explore it for a while, and feel safe to do so.
Cool. Well, look, I do want to go ahead and thank you for your time, Brock. I appreciate it. I know that you are in the process of moving right now, so you
Yes.
busting out a little bit of time for us is very, very appreciated. And let me know if you need help because I have a van and I'll help you move.
Yeah, I'll probably take you up on
Well, look,
that.
on behalf of the National At Home Dad Network, I want to thank everybody who joined us and all of you who are watching the replay, whether that's on our Facebook page or on our YouTube page, where we have all of our past webinars available for watching, as well as our podcasts and several other resources. I want to thank you guys and wish you all a happy holidays. We are going to be taking December off from doing a webinar because as we get closer to the holidays, I don't think anybody's going to have time to get away from family and commitments to sit down with us or even watch. So we will see everybody in January. And in the meantime, you guys have a great day. Bye.